There are things they don't teach you in graduate school, not because the professors don't know, but because some knowledge only comes one way, through your own skin. My name is Caroline. I'm 38 years old. I've been a therapist for 13 years. I know how to listen in a way most people don't. I notice what someone doesn't say out loud. I can hold someone else's pain without dissolving into it. I thought that made me smarter in my personal life too. That was my greatest mistake. Last November, a young woman came to see me, 29 years old, chestnut hair to her shoulders. She sat with her hands folded very neatly in her lap, like she was afraid to take up too much space. She came with what so many people come with. Something in her relationship felt wrong, but she couldn't name what. A standard story. I had heard hundreds like it. By the third session, I understood she was talking about my husband. She didn't know who I was. I didn't know who she was. We simply sat in two chairs across from each other, and she told me about Daniel. She never used his name. I listened and nodded and made notes in my pad because 13 years had built reflexes stronger than any shock. This is where I want to begin. But first, that morning. A few hours before everything changed. Because if I don't tell you about that morning, you won't understand how ordinary it was. And that matters. That might be the most important part of this whole story. That morning was a Tuesday. I know that precisely because on Tuesdays I have 5 sessions back-to-back with a lunch break, and I always wake up with a faint preemptive exhaustion. Not a bad feeling, just a working one. Daniel was already in the kitchen when I came down. He always gets up before me. That was one of the things I loved about him from the beginning. He never needed me to be a morning person. He just made coffee for both of us and left my cup on the mat beside the stove. That morning, I picked up my cup, took the first sip, and said something about the weather. He said something about traffic. We stood at the window looking at the street. A gray November morning, wet asphalt, the neighbor's dog pulling its leash toward the park. An ordinary morning, completely ordinary. Daniel worked at an architectural firm on Meridian Street. Senior partner, serious projects, constant client meetings. He stayed late often. I never considered that a problem. I have evening sessions too, emergency calls after 9. We both understood that work is work. He finished his coffee and set the cup in the sink, put on his coat, the gray wool one I bought him the Christmas before. He kissed me on the temple, said he might be late tonight. A client meeting had been moved to the evening. I said okay. He closed the door. I picked up my phone and checked my schedule. 5 sessions. First one at 10, last one at 6. When I think about that morning now, I keep coming back to one thing. I spent 13 years learning how people give themselves away. Tone of voice. A pause a fraction too long. Eyes that drift slightly left when they should hold steady. I am trained to catch these things. I read people the way others read text, and I saw nothing. Either Daniel was very good, or I had stopped really looking at him. I still don't know which one is worse. We met 6 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday party. I had just opened my private practice, and I was in that particular state where a person is simultaneously exhausted and very pleased with herself. I had rented a small office on the 2nd floor of an older building. Not many clients yet, but they were coming. I felt like I was moving in the right direction. At the party, I almost left immediately. Too loud, too many people, wine I didn't like. I was already composing my goodbye when someone stepped up beside me at the window and said without preamble, "Are you counting the minutes too?" I turned around. Daniel. Tall, dark sweater holding a glass of water, not wine. Water. I noticed that immediately. We stood at that window for 2 hours. We talked about cities. He's an architect. He cares deeply about how space is arranged, how a single corner can change the feeling of an entire room. I talked about how people are arranged on the inside. We were both doing essentially the same thing with different materials. That's what caught us. A year later, he proposed in that same apartment, at that same friend's place. No restaurant, no grand gesture. He just said, "I think I want to stand at a lot more windows with you, if you don't mind." I didn't mind. 4 years of marriage, not perfect ones. There were weeks when we barely talked, each of us deep in our own work. There were dinners when we both looked at our phones instead of each other. An ordinary life for two busy people. But underneath all of that, there was something solid. Or I believed there was. I believed in us with the particular sobriety of someone who knows too much about relationships to build illusions. I saw us clearly and chose us anyway. Now I understand that wasn't sobriety. It was blindness with a very good justification. Amy came to me for the first time on a Friday, the 3rd of October. I remember the date because it was the day after I had closed a difficult case. A client I had been working with for a year and a half had finally stabilized enough that we agreed to move to once-a-month sessions. It's always a slightly strange feeling, not a loss but an emptiness, like a room someone has moved the furniture out of. Amy filled that emptiness almost literally. She called the next day. The first session is always an introduction. I explain how I work. The client explains why they came. No pressure, no deep questions, just space. Amy spoke carefully, weighing each word, the way people do when they're afraid of saying too much. That itself is information. People who are afraid of taking up space have usually occupied too little of it in someone else's life. She mentioned a partner briefly. They had been together about a year and a half. She loved him, but she always had the feeling she never knew where he really was, even when he was physically right beside her. I wrote in my notes, emotional unavailability, anxious attachment, a standard picture. She never used his name. I never asked. That's not what the first session is for. The second session was a week later. Amy came in slightly looser, a little less tension in her shoulders, hands not quite so perfectly arranged on her knees. People who are getting better start worrying less about how they appear. That's a good sign in therapy. She spoke more concretely. Her partner stayed late at work often. He canceled plans at the last minute sometimes. Always with an explanation, always convincing. But the explanations had started sounding rehearsed over time. Too smooth. No hesitation. I thought, she's describing classic anxiety. Not necessarily because the partner is hiding something. Sometimes people with anxious attachment see threat where there is none. My job was to help her understand what was happening in her, not in him. That is the professional error I now see very clearly. I focused on Amy, on her anxiety, on her patterns. I didn't really listen to what she was telling me about him. He stays late often. He cancels at the last minute, always with an explanation. If I had listened differently, I could have asked other questions by the second session. Where does he work? Doing what? How long have you been together? I didn't ask, because that wasn't my role. And then that Tuesday came, the third session, and Amy spoke differently, not about her feelings, about a specific incident, about the previous Wednesday, about how he canceled again, said he was stuck at work, and about how she had seen his car. Amy was talking. I was listening. A silver Audi near Riverside at 9 in the evening. He was supposed to be in a work meeting. She had called him. He answered, said he was still at the office, at least another hour. She didn't mention that she had seen the car. She just listened to his voice and thought, is he lying or am I losing my mind? I held my pen over my notepad. I wrote, cognitive dissonance, possible gaslighting or anxious interpretation. Explore further. There was already something cold inside me, but I didn't know yet what it was. There are many silver Audis. Riverside is a long street. I told myself, coincidence. I am a professional, I don't project. Then Amy said, he's an architect. I stopped writing, not sharply. My hand just slowed and stopped, like a mechanism that had run out of winding. There are many architects in the city too. I told myself that as well, very convincingly. I almost believed it. Then Amy said, he always orders coffee with no milk but 1 spoon of brown sugar. He says white sugar ruins the flavor. I laughed at that when we first got together. Now I know his order by heart. I looked at my hands. Brown sugar, 1 spoon. I had been buying that sugar at our grocery store for 4 years, keeping a small jar on the kitchen shelf. I had never thought of it as anything strange. It wasn't strange. It was evidence. Amy's voice kept going. She was talking about something else now, a weekend they had spent together. A restaurant he knew. Small place, almost no sign out front, you had to know where to go. She laughed a little when she said it. The quiet laugh of someone remembering something that is sweet and painful at the same time. I knew that restaurant. Daniel had taken me there in the 2nd year of our marriage. He said he had stumbled across it by chance. A small Italian place. The owner takes the orders himself. Pasta made right in front of you. We sat by the window and he held my hand across the table and said he wanted to come back every year. We returned once, then somehow never again. Now I understood why. Tell me about habits of his that irritate you, I said to Amy, steady, professional. Through irritation, the real thing often surfaces. She thought for a moment. He never picks up on the first ring, she said. Always the second. Every single time. I've gotten used to it. I call, wait, hang up, call again. He says he just can't get to his phone fast enough. But it's every time, every single time. The same. I looked at the page of my notepad. For 4 years, I had been calling Daniel and waiting for the second ring. 4 years. I had always assumed it was just a habit. I had never thought about why someone would need that habit. The second ring gives you time to see who's calling, to decide whether to answer, to step out of the room if you need to. It wasn't a habit, it was a system. On the outside, I nodded. I said, interesting. How long have you noticed that? On the inside, I was sitting in our kitchen looking at the small jar of brown sugar on the shelf. A little wooden jar with a lid. I had bought it at a market before we were even married. It had always sat in the same spot. I had never once thought of it as a clue. Everything I had thought of as ours was turning out to be his instrument. Amy talked for another 20 minutes. I asked questions. The right questions, at the right pace, with the right pauses. I was flawless. I was professional. And at the same time, I was dismantling my marriage the way a mechanic dismantles an engine. Part by part, without rushing, without hysteria. Laying everything out across the floor to understand what exactly wasn't working and for how long. By the end of the session, I knew 3 things with certainty. First, this was Daniel. Second, Amy did not know who I was. Third, whatever I did next, I had to do it right. Not fast, not loudly, right. Amy went home that evening not knowing a thing. I stayed in my chair after the door closed, sat in the quiet. The white noise from the ventilation unit ran in the background. It had always been there. I had never once noticed it. It was the only real thing in the room. I thought about professional ethics. I thought about what I owed Amy. She was not complicit. She had come to me in genuine pain, not knowing who I was, not knowing she was describing the man I came home to every night. She deserved better than to continue seeing a therapist who had become a participant in her story. I thought about Daniel. Then I did the only thing I could do. I picked up my phone and texted Margaret Osei. I had found her name 3 days earlier, searched by specialty. Family law, financial disputes. 15 years of practice. I wrote I'd like to schedule a consultation. She replied within the hour, Thursday at 5:30 works. I put my phone in my bag, gathered my things, turned off the light. Franklin, the ficus, stood at the window in the dark. I had watered him that morning. He would be fine until Wednesday. I drove home. His car was in the driveway. I parked behind it and sat for a moment. Just looked at the silver Audi through my windshield. The same car Amy had seen near Riverside. The same car I had seen every day for 4 years and had never thought of as anything other than my husband's car. I took out my phone, opened my photos, found the last picture we had taken together. August, a trip to the lake, Daniel squinting in the sun and laughing at something just outside the frame. A good photo. I had thought at the time that I should print it. I looked at it for about a minute. Then I put my phone away, picked up my bag, and got out of the car. The hallway of our building smelled the way it always did. A faint dampness in someone's dinner from the upper floors. The elevator, the 3rd floor, our door. I took out my keys. My hands were not shaking. I noted that almost with surprise. The lock clicked. I went in. From the kitchen came garlic and olive oil. Quiet jazz playing. Daniel always puts on the same playlist when he cooks. I know it by heart. The light above the stove was on. Everything as usual. Everything exactly as always. You're early, he said without turning around. He was stirring something in the pan. My last session ended on time, I said. I hung up my coat, set down my bag, walked into the kitchen and stood at the refrigerator. My usual spot while he cooked. We always stood like that. Him at the stove, me at the fridge, talking about the day. He turned around, smiled, asked how I was. I looked at his face. 13 years of studying faces. I know what a person looks like when they're lying. Not in movies, not in books. In real life. In real life, it isn't darting eyes and nervous hands. In real life, it's very small things. A micro-expression lasting a fraction of a second. A pause a little shorter than an honest person needs. A smile that starts slightly before it reaches the eyes. Daniel smiled at me completely normally. Either he was very good, or he had lied for so long he had stopped feeling it as lying. Both possibilities were equally cold. Fine, I said, a little tired. How was your day? He started telling me. About a client meeting that ran long, about a project that wasn't coming together, about a colleague who had gotten something wrong again. An ordinary conversation. I stood at the refrigerator and listened and nodded at the right moments. Sometimes I said, right, I see, really. Inside I was thinking about something else. I was thinking, I need facts. Not feelings, not Amy's details, not the brown sugar and the Italian restaurant. Facts, dates, numbers, something that can't be explained away as coincidence. I am a therapist. I work with what people say. But I had been married to an architect for 4 years. I knew where he kept his documents. I knew his laptop password because he had told me himself when he asked me to print something about a year ago. I knew he cleared his browser history carelessly because once I had been looking for a recipe on his computer and saw open tabs he hadn't closed. I had never used that knowledge. Until this evening, it hadn't been knowledge. It had been background, the texture of a shared life. Now it was a toolkit. Daniel put a plate in front of me. Pasta, simple, garlic and herbs. He makes it when he's tired and doesn't want to think. I know that too. I know everything about this man. And somehow it turns out I knew nothing. We sat down. He poured wine. He touched his glass to mine. To the end of Tuesday, he said. To the end of Tuesday, I said. We ate. We talked about nothing in particular. A show we had been meaning to watch. Plans for the weekend. Whether the bulb in the hallway needed replacing. An ordinary dinner. I was fully present. I smiled at the right moments, answered thoughtfully, even laughed once at something he said. It was the strangest evening of my life, not because it was difficult, because it wasn't. It was perfectly normal, and that was the unbearable part. When he went to shower, I stayed at the table, picked up my glass, looked at the light above the stove. I had about 20 minutes. I stood up, walked to the study, and opened his laptop. I didn't go to his email. Email is emotion. Words, tone, confessions. I didn't need emotion right now. I needed numbers. Numbers don't lie and don't explain themselves. They just sit on the page and mean what they mean. I opened the browser, went to his online banking. We had one joint account for shared expenses. Each of us transferred a fixed amount in each month. Convenient, fair, no questions. His idea, actually. Now I understood why he had needed that structure. Separate personal accounts meant personal expenses nobody checked. I opened his personal card statement for the last 6 months. He kept the password in an unlocked notes folder on the laptop. People who feel secure stop being careful about small things. The first few minutes I just looked at the columns of numbers. Then I started seeing the pattern. Restaurants, not our restaurants, not the places we went to together. Others. I knew most of the places in our neighborhood and in the city center. In 4 years, Daniel and I had covered a lot of ground. These names I didn't recognize. Small amounts. $70, $90. Once, $120. Dinner for 2, regular, roughly every 10 days or so. I opened a notes document and began writing down dates. Hotels. 3 times in 6 months. Not expensive, not cheap. Mid-range, a boutique hotel. Once, a place outside the city. Amounts between $180 and $250. I checked the dates against our shared calendar. All 3 times he had been traveling for work. All 3 times I remembered those weekends. One of them, I had gone to the movies with a friend because I was alone. Another one, I had repainted a wall in the guest room we had never quite finished. While I was painting that wall, he was at a country inn with $250 on his card. I wrote that down, in neat handwriting, no pressure on the pen. Then flowers. 3 purchases at the same florist, not for my occasions. I checked, my birthday is in March, our anniversary in June. All 3 purchases were in other months. October, August, October again. October. Amy had come to me for her first session in early October. I looked at the date of the florist charge. October 8th. Her first session had been October 3rd. He had brought her flowers 5 days after she first walked through my door to ask for help. I closed my eyes for a few seconds. Not because it hurt, because I needed to hold it inside and not let it out before I was ready. The sound of the shower came from the hallway, still running. I had more time. I went back to the statements. The last thing I was looking for was transfers. Not to our joint account, to other accounts. Unknown numbers. There weren't any. Either he was careful enough not to transfer money to Amy directly, or she was independent enough not to need it. I filed that away too. It told me something about Amy. I copied everything into notes on my own phone. Dates, amounts, names. I took screenshots of the statements and emailed them to a personal account Daniel didn't know about. I had set it up 3 years ago for work correspondence with my supervisor. I had never mentioned it at home. A casual precaution, or maybe not so casual. Sometimes I think some part of me knew before the rest of me did. Then I closed the browser, returned everything to how it had been, closed the laptop. I stood up, smoothed my sweater, walked out into the hallway. The shower had stopped. Daniel was standing in the bedroom doorway in a t-shirt, looking at his phone. "What are you still doing up?" he asked without looking over. "Just writing something down," I said. "Work stuff." He nodded, put his phone down, got into bed. I got in beside him, turned off the light on my side, lay on my back looking at the ceiling. He fell asleep quickly. He always did. Daniel never had trouble sleeping. I used to envy that a little. I thought it was a character trait, a calm person, an even-tempered one. Now I had a different theory. People who sleep soundly are either at peace with who they are and who they show the world, or they've been living with the contradictions so long it stopped feeling like one. I lay beside him and thought about what I needed. A lawyer, a good one. Not the one mutual friends had recommended 2 years ago when we were drafting a will. My own. Someone he didn't know. And I needed to decide what to do about Amy. That decision came first, before everything else. I gave myself 1 week. I needed to know that what I had found was not misinterpretation. But I also knew I could not continue Amy's sessions. A therapist with a personal interest in a client's life is not a therapist. She is a participant. I had become a participant the moment Amy said brown sugar. The following Tuesday, Amy came in at 10. She sat down, set her bag on the floor. She looked a little better than the week before. Less tension in her shoulders, her hair down, more casual. People who are improving start caring less about how they present themselves. In therapy, that's a good sign. How was the week? I asked. Better, she said. She paused. We talked. Tell me about it, I said. She talked for about 10 minutes. They had met on Thursday. She had finally said what she felt, that she needed more clarity, that she was tired of not knowing where she stood in his life. He had listened. He said he understood. He said she mattered to him. I watched her face while she spoke. I saw what I see in people who have finally said aloud what they had been carrying inside for a long time. Relief. Fragile and cautious. She didn't yet know whether to believe him, but the fact that she had said it was hers. I looked at her and held two things in my mind at the same time. First, Amy was not at fault. She didn't know he was married. Everything she had told me was her genuine pain. He had been stringing her along the same way he had strung me along, just differently. Second, I could not continue these sessions, not because it was unbearable to sit across from her, though that was also true, but because I could no longer be useful to her. My job was to protect Amy from my own situation. When she finished talking, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, Amy, I want to talk to you about our work together. I need to be honest with you. She looked up, cautious. I think you would benefit from working with a different therapist, I said. Not because anything is wrong here, but a conflict of interest has come up on my end. Something in my own circumstances that I can't share with you. It would be unprofessional of me to do so. What I can tell you is that you deserve someone who can be fully present with you, and right now, I can't offer that. A long pause. Is it because of me? She asked quietly. Did I do something wrong? No, I said, and that was the plain truth. This has nothing to do with you. You're doing everything right. That's exactly why you deserve better than what I can give you right now. I gave her the name of a colleague, Diane Park. Someone I had worked alongside for 10 years, someone I trusted completely. I wrote it on a card. I told Amy I would pass along a brief overview to Diane if Amy gave her consent. No details, just enough to give the work a foundation. Amy took the card. She looked at it. Are you sure? She said. Yes, I said. That was also the plain truth. She left 20 minutes later. This time she didn't look back at the door. I sat in the quiet and thought that I had just done the only fully right thing in the past 2 weeks. The rest of the right things were still ahead of me. Margaret Ose, I worked on the 8th floor of a glass building downtown. The reception area was spare. Gray carpet, 2 chairs, a front desk. No magazines, no plants. The people who came here didn't flip through magazines in the waiting room. They sat and thought about what had brought them. I sat and thought about numbers. Margaret came out exactly on time. Dark suit, close-cut hair, a handshake that was dry and direct. She led me into her office, closed the door, sat across from me. You mentioned on the phone that you had gathered some things, she said. Show me. I took out my phone. Opened the folder I had built that night while Daniel slept beside me. Screenshots of the statements, the table of dates and amounts, restaurant names, 3 hotels, the florist charge dated October 8th. Everything organized and labeled. Margaret looked without speaking. She scrolled. Once she stopped, enlarged a screenshot, nodded. Good, she said. This is a solid foundation, but it won't be enough in court. The statements show expenses. They don't show who the money was spent on. I understand, I said. What else do we need? She set the phone on the table between us. Official confirmation of the relationship. Photographs, correspondence, witness testimony. Without it, he can say he was having dinner with colleagues and the court can't disprove it. Second, a full accounting of joint assets before he has time to move anything. Third, his stake in the firm. You said he's a senior partner? Yes. Then there's a partnership agreement. I need a copy or at minimum the firm's name. I can find the rest through the registry. At divorce, his stake is divisible if it was acquired during the marriage or grew in value during the marriage. I listened and felt something shift inside me. Not relief exactly. Something more solid, like standing on soft ground for a long time and suddenly feeling concrete underfoot. There's one more thing, Margaret said. You mentioned you learned about the relationship through a professional context. I'm not asking for details, but if that information surfaces during proceedings, we need to be ready to explain it. It won't surface, I said. I've already closed that issue. Margaret looked at me for a moment. Good, she said, and I understood she was not asking further. Smart people know when not to ask. A private investigator, I said. Do you work with someone specific? She opened a desk drawer and produced a card. She slid it across the table, just a name and phone number, nothing else. Tell him I referred you, she said. He understands what clients like you need. Fast, clean, documented. I took the card. Now about the property, Margaret said and opened her laptop. The apartment is in both names? Yes, we bought it 2 years into the marriage. Mortgage, paid off last year. Joint payments. Good, cars. His is an Audi, mine is a Honda. Both registered separately to each of us. Savings, joint accounts. One joint account we both contribute to monthly for shared expenses. Personal accounts are separate. How much is roughly in the joint account? I told her. Withdraw half before you file, she said, as evenly as she might discuss the weather. That is your legal right, joint account. Do it the day before you file, not earlier. Otherwise, he'll have time to respond. I nodded. One more thing, Margaret said. She closed the laptop and looked at me directly. You're still living together? Yes. How long can you sustain that? I thought for a second. As long as it takes. She looked at me a moment longer. Then something almost like approval passed across her face. Very slight, very professional. Here is the plan, she said. First, the investigator. Simultaneously, I'll assess the firm's stake through the registry and public filings. Once we have confirmation of the relationship and a full picture of the assets, you open a personal account in your name, transfer half the joint funds, and we file. He learns about it on the day we file. Not before. He learns about it on the day we file. I thought about that phrase the whole drive home. He learns on the day we file, not from me, from a courier with documents. He'll come in from work, maybe be in the kitchen cooking something, maybe put on his jazz playlist. And then the doorbell. I didn't need to make a scene. I didn't need to shout or cry or throw things. Part of me wanted to. But the colder, smarter part understood that a scene gives him too much. A scene is emotion. You can survive emotion. Wait it out. Minimize it. You can't survive documents. I came home 20 minutes before Daniel. Warmed up some soup, set the table. When he walked in, I asked how his day had been. He told me. I listened, everything as usual. There was just a little left to do. 3 weeks is 21 days. I didn't count the days. I counted the dinners, because dinners were the hardest. In the morning, there are errands, you can be busy, you can look at your phone, you can say you're tired. At the dinner table, you can't. At the table, you have to be a wife. I was a wife. The first week was the hardest. Not because I nearly broke, but because I never felt close to it. That itself was strange. I had expected it would be difficult to hold my expression. What I found was that holding my expression was exactly what I do best. 13 years of practice. I hold other people's pain every single day and don't show that it reaches me. Holding my own turned out to be no different. Just colder. On the Tuesday of the second week, Daniel brought home flowers, yellow chrysanthemums wrapped in simple paper. He put them on the kitchen table and said, "Just because, no occasion." I put them in a vase, thanked him, kissed him on the cheek. Then I went to the bathroom, closed the door, turned on the tap, and stood over the sink for about a minute. I looked at the water. Then I turned off the tap. I went back out. The chrysanthemums lasted until the end of the week. I threw them out when he was at work. On the Friday of that same week, we had dinner with his colleagues, a firm event that had been planned since summer. A restaurant downtown, noisy and dressed up. I wore the blue dress Daniel likes. I smiled, talked, laughed at the stories his partner Rick told. Rick was a heavy-set man around 50 with a good sense of humor and obvious respect for Daniel. I watched Rick and thought, does he know? Colleagues often know, not everything but something, in peripheral ways, through small things. Rick gave nothing away. Either he didn't know, or he was better at this than me. In the cab home, Daniel took my hand, said I had been wonderful tonight, said everyone had asked how he got so lucky. I looked out the window at the city going by at night. Lucky, I thought. Yes. At the end of the second week, I opened my own account. A bank in a different part of the city, one where we had no shared products. A small branch. I went after work on a Thursday. The manager was young and chatty and asked if I'd be moving my paycheck over. I said not yet, just a savings account for now. He nodded and had everything done in 15 minutes. I stood on the sidewalk outside with a new card in my wallet, a small rectangle of plastic, an account in my name. Only mine. I couldn't remember the last time I'd had something that was only mine. The third week brought snow. Early, unexpected, late November. Daniel delighted in it like a child, wanted to go walking. We went. We walked through our neighborhood. He talked about a building his firm was designing, showed the shape of it with his hands. He always uses his hands when he talks about architecture. It was one of the things I had loved about him. I walked beside him and listened. The snow fell quietly. Street lamps reflected in the wet pavement. It was a good evening, objectively good. I thought, this is the cruelest part of it. Not that he is a terrible person every minute, but that he is a decent person most of the time. He's funny and smart, and he sees beauty in things others walk past. All of that is true, and the affair is also true. Both things exist inside the same person at the same time, and that doesn't make it easier or clearer. I thought about this calmly. The way you think about a theorem you've already proven. On the 20th day, a message came from Margaret. Assessment of the firm is ready. Call when you can. I called from a parking lot, sitting in my car with the engine running. Margaret gave me a number. I was quiet for several seconds. His stake in the firm had nearly tripled in value over the 4 years of our marriage. A large municipal contract they had landed 2 years earlier had significantly raised the company's valuation. The increase in value during the marriage was subject to division. The total figure, including the apartment, the joint account, and his stake in the firm, was substantial. Very substantial. I sat in my car and stared at the shopping center across the parking lot. I remembered him at the firm dinner that Friday when Rick made a toast. Said the firm was on a real upswing, the best year in a decade, even more ahead. Daniel had smiled and said thank him the team. He had told me that evening, without knowing it, exactly how high the stakes were. The investigator should have something by tomorrow, Margaret said. Once we have the materials, we set a date. Good, I said. Caroline, she said, a slightly different tone, not the work voice. How are you holding up? I thought for a second. Ready, I said, a pause, then I'll be in touch. I put my phone away, shifted into drive, drove home. Day 21 was ending. Tomorrow, something different would begin. The file came the next day, not a physical file. The investigator sent an encrypted archive to my email, the password in a separate message. I opened everything in my car in the clinic parking lot between my morning session and lunch. Engine off. Gray December outside. I typed in the password and opened the first file. The photographs were sharp. Good camera, good angle. Professional, Daniel and Amy outside the Italian restaurant. She was looking at him. He was holding the door open for her, an ordinary gesture. I had seen it 1,000 times. He always held the door. I had always taken it as good manners. Next photograph, they were at a table by the window. He was holding her hand across the table. I stayed on that one longer than the others, not because it hurt, because I remembered. He had held my hand across a table in that same restaurant, in exactly the same position. Same table, even, possibly literally the same table. I scrolled on. Another restaurant, a different one. A parking lot at a shopping center. They were walking side by side, her bag on his shoulder. A hotel entrance. They were walking in together. The timestamp read 7:34 p.m. The date matched one of his work trips. The last photograph was just a street. They were standing together, talking. She was laughing. He was looking at her. I tried to remember the last time he had looked at me like that. I couldn't. I closed the archive. Opened a message to Margaret and typed 3 words, ready to proceed. She replied in 7 minutes. Friday. Everything is ready on my side. You'll need to transfer half the joint account Thursday evening. I put my phone away, got out of the car, walked into the clinic. Sat in my chair 2 minutes before my next client arrived. The session went fine. On Thursday evening, Daniel stayed late at work. I transferred half the joint account to my own. The transaction took 4 minutes. Then I made dinner, set the table, and waited for him to come home. He came in at 8:30, apologized for being late. 8, told me about a difficult day. I listened and nodded and asked about the project. That night I didn't sleep. Not from anxiety. I just lay there looking at the ceiling and thought about the morning. Daniel breathed beside me. Even, quiet, the way he always did. I listened to him breathe through that last night and thought. I did love him, that didn't go away. It just no longer mattered. Friday morning I was up at 6:30. I made coffee. When Daniel came into the kitchen, I handed him his cup and told him I'd be late tonight, dinner with a colleague. He said okay, kissed my temple, took his coat, closed the door. I stood at the window and watched him walk to his car. Silver Audi. He opened the door, got in, drove away. I picked up my phone and texted Margaret, he's gone. She replied, the courier will leave at 1. First delivery to the firm, second to the apartment in case he stays late. I put down my phone, finished my coffee, got dressed and drove to work. Until 1 o'clock I had 3 sessions. I ran all 3 of them, completely, professionally, without a single unnecessary pause. That was not a feat, that was just my work. Work I love and am good at. At 1:15, a message from Margaret delivered to the firm. Signature received. I sat between sessions and looked at those words. Delivered. Signature received. He was already holding the envelope, or had opened it, or was reading it. I didn't know exactly where he was at that moment, In his office. In the conference room. Maybe with Rick. I didn't know what expression was on his face. For the first time in 3 weeks, I was a little curious. At 1:45, my phone buzzed. Daniel. I looked at the screen for 3 seconds. Then I declined the call and sent a text. I'm in a session, I'll call you later. That was not true. My next session was at 2:30, but I had nothing to say to him. Everything that needed to be said was on 20 pages that Margaret had prepared over 3 weeks. The apartment, the joint account, his stake in the firm, documented expenses on another woman during the marriage, dates, amounts, and an attachment of photographs from the investigator. 20 pages. Everything I wanted to say to him, only more precise, and in the language that courts speak. He called again at 3. I declined again. I texted. I'll be home at 7, we can talk then. Let him wait. I had waited 3 weeks. I arrived home exactly at 7. His car was in the driveway. Every light in the apartment was on, all of them. As though darkness were a problem that could be solved by flipping switches. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor. I went in with my key. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table. The documents were spread in front of him, all 20 pages. He had read them. The edges of some pages were bent. A glass of whiskey sat beside them. He didn't normally drink whiskey. That was information. He looked up when I walked in. I hung up my coat, set down my bag, walked to the kitchen and sat across from him. My usual seat, the one I had always sat in at this table for 4 years. A few seconds of silence. When did you find out, he said. Not a question, just words. 3 weeks ago. Something crossed his face. He was counting. 3 weeks. All the dinners, the firm event, the walk in the snow, I watched him count it. Caroline, he started. You don't need to, I said. Let me explain. Daniel. I said his name evenly. Without pressure. The way you say a word that already explains everything on its own. I've worked with people who explain things for 13 years. I know every explanation there is. I know what they sound like when someone believes what they're saying. And I know what they sound like when they don't. I don't need to hear yours. He went quiet. I looked at the documents in front of him. It's all there, I said. The apartment, the account, the firm, Margaret Osei. Her contact is on the first page. From here on, through her, you don't even want to talk, he said. Quietly, almost lost, I thought for a moment. Do you remember what you said to me once when you proposed? That you wanted to stand at a lot more windows with me? He looked at me. I remember. So do I stood up. That's exactly why I have nothing left to say to you. I picked up my bag, walked to the hallway. Took from the closet the suitcase I had packed on Wednesday, methodically, without rushing. I set it by the door. You're leaving, he said from the kitchen. Yes. Where? That's not your concern anymore. I put on my coat. I took the suitcase. I opened the door. Caroline, I stopped. I didn't turn around. I'm sorry, he said. I stood in the open doorway and thought, he means that. He is genuinely sorry. It doesn't change a thing. But it is true, and I know the difference between true and not true. I know, I said, and I closed the door. The elevator was slow. It had always been slow in our building. It had irritated me for 4 years. Standing in that car for the last time with my suitcase, I thought, at least I won't be waiting for this elevator anymore. A small freedom, but still. My friend Renee lived 15 minutes away. I had called her 3 weeks ago, the day I opened the investigator's archive. I hadn't explained much, just said, I'm going to need somewhere to stay for a few weeks. She didn't ask questions. She said, the room is ready. That is what the right people in your life look like. I drove through the city at night and found myself thinking about something unexpected. I was thinking about Franklin, my ficus in the office. He sits at the window. I water him on Wednesdays. He has outlasted 3 assistants, and he outlasted this too. Tomorrow morning I would come into the clinic, sit in my chair, and have my first session at 10. Life continues. Not despite what happened. It simply continues, in parallel, without pausing for reflection. I've said that to clients hundreds of times. Now I know it from the inside. The divorce was finalized in 5 months. Margaret was precise. The apartment was divided. His stake in the firm was assessed at its market value on the date of filing. The court treated the documented expenses on another woman during the marriage as a misappropriation of joint funds. The final settlement was exactly the figure Margaret had named at our first meeting. Substantial. Daniel contested almost nothing. I think he understood that with what was in the attachment to those documents, there was nowhere to argue from. Rick bought out his stake in the firm 3 months after we filed. Daniel opened a small solo practice. I learned that through a mutual acquaintance. I hadn't been looking, it was just information. I never saw Amy again. Diane Park, the colleague I referred her to, mentioned only that the work was ongoing. She gave no details, and I didn't ask. I hope Amy got the honest answers she deserved, not from me, but from someone. I kept the same office. Same chairs, same lamp in the corner. Franklin is still at the window. I changed one thing only. I took the small jar of brown sugar off the kitchen shelf in my new apartment. I bought white sugar instead. It turns out white sugar is perfectly fine. A small thing. But sometimes a small thing is exactly what you need. I'm not telling you this story because I want your sympathy, and not so that you'll draw conclusions about men, or marriages, or therapists who fail to see what's right in front of them. I'm telling it because I came to understand something. An experience you can't prevent, you can at least use. Turn into something, into understanding, into strength, into a story that someone hears and finds a piece of their own inside it. For 13 years, I held other people's stories. This one was mine, and you know what is strange. I carry it more easily than many of the ones I've heard. Because at the end of this story, I walked out of an elevator, loaded a suitcase into a trunk, and drove to a friend who had left a light on for me. That turned out to be enough.